Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Intel FutureGen broadcast. I'm Becky, Senior Partnerships Manager at NSE. I am joined today by Matt Watson, who is the Director of Learning and Development at the International Federation of Esports Coaches. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Becky.
How are you today?
I'm all right. Yeah, I'm happy to have some
Awesome.
sun outside, and yeah, good to be here.
Great. Before we jump into today's topic, I quickly want to explain what FutureGen is for anyone new here. So Intel FutureGen is a yearly program that NSE delivers with the support of Intel, where we take 20 UK university students that we believe could be the future leaders in the esports industry, where they get access to events, mentors, sessions with industry leaders. So while the selected cohort get access to all that good stuff, we also do public broadcasts as well, like this one, so the wider student community and anyone else can learn from these sessions. So Matt, you're going to talk to us today about esports coaching. Why don't you take it away with what you've prepared for us?
Sure. Thanks, Becky. As I said, pleasure to be here. Honor to be talking to future leaders in esports, and hopefully my presentation is of some interest to some of you. I've sort of adapted or adjusted the title slightly. So moving from coaching esports to coaching in esports, sort of recognizing the fact that there are multiple games, and usually you would be a coach in just one. But today I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about how I see the role of the coach within esports, and sort of general ideas and principles that underline that view of things, and our work at IFoEC, International Federation of Esports Coaches. So hopefully it's a enjoyable and at the least moderately interesting. Let's proceed. Okay, good stuff. So just a quick overview of this short presentation I'm going to give. First of all, meet the team. So I'll introduce myself. I'll introduce some of my esteemed colleagues. I'll talk a little bit about what IFoEC is and sort of what we do, where we work. And then I'll get into the main part of the session, which is looking at what coaches in esports actually do. Then we'll discuss perhaps some of the tricky part of their work and what it means to be a coach in esports, and where it might be the same or similar to coaching in sports, but also slightly different. And then I'll touch on some research that I've done, and that looked into the experience of being a coach in esports. And that might open some areas of interest for future research or for students today sort of to explore and think about in their work. And then if we have any time at the end, a couple of questions, but of course, I mean, feel free to ask them along the way and interrupt as you see fit. I'm more than happy to go off on a tangent. So that's the overview. Who am I? So Matt Watson, I guess the easy way of thinking about my role is coach developer, and specifically coach developer in esports. Underpinning that practice and that interest is research. So for the last getting on for 8 years now, I've been slowly progressing my PhD at the German Sport University in Cologne. And the initial topic of that PhD was the coach as a performer in sport. So looking at the pressure to produce results and act a certain way and take care of a team of people, and also have the tactics and strategy in mind, and all the additional layers of work that a coach typically has on their shoulders. And then about a couple of years into that PhD, a complete U-turn on the focus, and I really tunneled into this emerging role of a coach in esports, and how that was different, how that was similar. And that has, as I said, underpinned a lot of the work that I do today and that IFoEC does today. I also lecture. So, I mean, this is an example of a lecture I might give. And I work with various universities around the globe. And that's enormously rewarding for me to be able to talk to people about how I see things, share my research, and also sort of engage with the student body at those various institutions to get their opinions, because this is just one perspective on things. Granted, I think it's based in a reasonable amount of evidence, but there's also there's an enormous esports industry out there, and I think that there are different perspectives. Some people may see things differently, and I always say that actually it's more important that at the end of listening to me speak, hopefully your thoughts are perhaps more in order or strengthened as a result of hearing my perspective on things. You may not necessarily agree, and that's absolutely fine. The two pictures there, just up for your information, the top one there is a coach education workshop I gave back in 2019 to the staff over at Rogue. A colleague of mine who was working as a performance coach with Rogue at the time, their League of Legends team, Ismael Pedraza Ramirez, invited me over. And that sort of lit the fire, really engaged my interest in coaching at the highest level of esports, because these coaches were very interested in the sort of sports psychology, sport coaching pedagogy principles from research and how they could be applied into esports. And at the time, there really wasn't much for them to go on, and a lot of their work they'd refined through trial and error. So that was a wonderful experience and really opened my eyes to what was possible within esports and the demand for support for coaches. The other picture there is I reached a reasonably good level as a basketball coach, coaching in the 4th league in Germany. And towards the end of that experience, I felt firsthand the pressure that coaches have to shoulder. So although that experience was very valuable to understand sort of what it means to be working with athletes that are, being paid full time to perform, and you're coaching in front of arenas full of people, it was also quite an isolated role. You feel the pressure to win. You have to explain yourself to the local media after a loss. After a win, it's sort of business as usual. And I think the time devoted to that job, I could say it was maybe sort of detrimental to mental health, in that it absorbed a lot of energy and time away from social support and few peers to turn to. So part of my motivation for being in esports is seeing if we can do things maybe slightly differently. So that's the long spiel about who I am. I'm delighted to be able to work with some brilliant individuals. At the head of sort of the IFoEC team here, we've got Dr. Laura Swettenham, who's our head of research. She's a fully qualified sport and exercise psychologist, and she does a lot of work looking into things like acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness approaches for performance in esports. And she's worked with a number of teams and has some really incredible insights into supporting performance and individual health and well-being in the esports space. Callum Abbott, our head of performance, another brilliant mind, another sport and exercise psychologist. He's probably got the most experience in the most different esports games of all of us, and he's done some extraordinary things, like he's been on site over in LA for the recent Rocket League major, or the autumn Rocket League major, and we certainly look to him for explaining and sort of helping support the practical side of working in esports. So being on stage, what it means for those performers and how we can best support them. Matt Ashford, a more recent member of the team, also a sport and exercise psychologist. He had recent experiences working and supporting young performers at Aston Villa Football Club, for example. And he's really helped me make sense of the uncertainty of esports. So he brings a lot of frameworks that we can work from to sort of track our progress and monitor the support that we're giving to teams and coaches in esports. And especially during COVID, when uncertainty was everywhere, it helps to have someone that can map things out like that. So enormously grateful to be able to work with people like this, and together we try and sort of move the needle, try and improve esports in whatever way we can. One of those ways is by producing research. So as I said, I'm a PhD researcher. Many of my colleagues also produce scientific research. And just a couple of highlights here. Callum and I, together with Ismael Pedraza Ramirez, produce a perspective paper on how a performance coach and a sports psychologist could work together to support esports teams. And more recently, Laura produced a study, which was a case study, sort of writing about her experience working with an esports team and how she helped to develop team cohesion and the challenges to that within that team. So I invite you to read them and follow our research if you're interested in that. So getting on with it, what does IFoEC do? Like, why are we all on the team? So the mission statement would be, we are here to support, develop, and promote coaches and support staff in esports. And why we're doing this is we think that by supporting these individuals, we help to keep people safe from harm, abuse, and neglect. In other words, sort of raise the standard of safeguarding, because esports is often primarily online, and it can open doors to bad actors that maybe don't have the best intentions. And we hope by training staff and coaches to be aware of these things, we can reduce the chances of anything untoward happening. We also think that by supporting coaches, we can promote positive individual growth. That's involving the players, the coaches themselves, even sort of organizational and administrative staff involved in organizations, even the broader fan base, if we promote good messaging. And that, in turn, hopefully will contribute to positive industry growth, which we all want to see, because we're passionate about this area and we'd like to see it continue to grow and go from strength to strength. And finally, with those foundations in place, we would hope to see an improvement in performance, which makes it a more attractive thing, a more engaging thing, and perhaps a better product for external interest. So that's IFoEC in a nutshell. That's our mission. Now over to the sort of crux of the session. What does an esports coach do? If I hadn't rambled for so long, I might ask you to write in the chat what you think an esports coach does, because I'm sure you all have an idea. You all have a perspective on this, and whether you know it or not, you've probably been influenced by coaches in the past, or perhaps seeing an autobiography of a famous coach in sport, and you've taken some ideas or some perceptions with you from that. There is some writing out there that can help us answer this question. So, for example, there are the Esports Awards for coaching. So there is an award for Coach of the Year, and there's a whole panel that will vote on this. And the Coach of the Year will be someone who has been seen to directly improve the results of a team, to improve the team quality and the working lives of their players. The coach will be good in some area, such as pre-game preparation, providing some sort of motivational boost in the form of a pep talk, or providing valuable insights into the team's play. And again, this is all off the website of the Esports Awards and the Coach of the Year criteria. And they use this interesting phrase that without them, their team would be significantly worse off. So you can get the impression here that the coach is an important role. More academic writing can be found in textbooks. So there's the Esports Business Management textbook, which is a really good read, and they define a number of different roles in esports, one of them being game coaches. And it's a lot of words on the screen, and I apologize for that, but their definition of game coaches is sort of around analyzing gameplay, identifying strategies, strengths, weaknesses of their own players and the opponents, and doing a lot of game-specific work, basically, and setting the vision for how they're going to play and put their players in the best position to win. There is also very little research out there on the role of the coach, and by research I mean sort of objective, peer-reviewed scientific work that has studied multiple coaches and made generalizations about what they do. But there is some, and a recent paper looked at coaches and tried to define what they do and came up with a number of interesting points that were perhaps broader than just the game-specific stuff. So it was bringing the players together, developing synergy and trust, looking at the strategy and the tactics in the form of micro and macro play, certainly, but then also, interestingly, the use of goals to motivate players and keep their development and improvement on track. So we're starting to get into maybe a different level of work that a coach might do. But is that everything? And you may have, as I was reading through these ideas, you may have thought, well, something's missing, or I disagree with that. And I think that's really valuable to sort of think about and be aware of. For me, there is a few things missing from this. Excuse the sort of shameless selfie in a sense. We were doing some work with a team based in France, and we were all online and they were all offline. And the next thing I knew, I was on YouTube, and our work was sort of being streamed. But it was an interesting experience, very challenging to work online to a team and coaches that are offline. But anyway, to me, coaching is an activity that aims to help individuals flourish, both professionally, so as players, and also as people, so personally. You might have heard the phrase sort of holistic approach or holistic performance approach. So this idea that we're not just here to play the game, and if we only focus on playing the game, then we're maybe missing a significant part of what it means to be a human. And if we support that sort of broader growth, maybe we can achieve higher levels of performance or meaning. And so I think coaching is important in that respect, especially in esports. I think the coaching is often complex and messy. So I think that if we only focus on the in-game stuff, then we can't control everything in-game. And so we might be heading down a path where things are sort of bound to fail. And then finally, I also think that coaching is not something that we just do to players. So I don't think coaches are, like installing a CD and downloading some software onto your hard drive. I think it's an interactive process. I think coaching involves players. I think coaches are as impacted by their players as the players are by them. So within that sort of broader definition, it's interesting that a couple of quotes out there in academic literature hint at this. So this quote by some researchers that I respect a great deal talk about how effective team leadership is ensuring that the functions that are most critical for achieving purposes are identified and fulfilled. And if we just dwell on that phrase, or those two words there, most critical, what is a critical function in order to perform and play well? Well, you could say it's the game-specific knowledge, it's having the coach that provides the appropriate tactics and strategy and the vision for the team. You could also step away from the game and say, well, it's critical that you've had a good night's sleep. It's critical that you've looked after your diet and that you're healthy and happy and you've got thriving social relationships behind you in order to even turn up at your desk and participate in the team environment. So to me, it's all fairly critical. And I think the performance puzzle is broader than just the game-specific stuff. And I think coaches have a role to play in some cases, in those broader levels. So what we're getting at here is, what do your players, what does your team need? And we're going to touch a little bit now on needs. So you may have heard this phrase, cognitive athletes. In research papers, especially earlier last few years, we saw this term quite a lot. So this idea that if you're a professional in esports or even an amateur player in esports, so at that competitive gaming level, you might be a cognitive athlete. And if we think about the term cognitive athlete, that suggests some needs already. So a cognitive athlete would probably need a high level of game knowledge, they'd need game skill, and they'd need abilities, so perceptual cognitive abilities to be able to execute within the game and execute and deliver on their game-specific knowledge. But is that everything? Is that all that your cognitive athlete needs? Is that all that the individual on your League of Legends team really needs to be able to thrive personally and professionally? Well, I'll hopefully suggest that it's not, because if you think about everything that surrounds that individual, you've got the need to turn up and train. You've got the need to understand your role within many other roles or how they complement other roles. You've got the need to play within a team and cooperate with other members on your team. You've got the need to play on stage in front of fans and within a very perhaps high pressure environment. And you've also got social relationships to maintain outside of the game. So at the bottom there, we've got parents. This player is not just plugging in, playing the game and getting out of it. They may also have the support or not of their family. And they could be playing purely online and they have to go downstairs and explain why they're spending so many hours in front of the screen. That's a very real problem for some athletes, esports athletes, cognitive athletes. So within this picture, we're already seeing there are many more needs than just the game-specific stuff. We're seeing that there's a need for self-awareness, self-regulation, certainly interpersonal skill, effective training, and what that means. Is it just scrim after scrim after scrim? Personal health and well-being. If you're unhealthy or ill, it's hard to turn up and give your best effort to really move forward in terms of your esports performance. Lifestyle management. So not basically, but if you're on a sort of dual career, like you're also at university and you're also studying, how do you manage your time to be able to be effective in both domains? There are multiple layers of needs here. And the other complicated thing about them is that these needs are likely to change and fluctuate, and it's not linear. Sometimes they improve, sometimes they recede a little bit, and sometimes it's hard to explain where we're at. They're also individual. So we're talking about the needs of one individual player, but there are obviously many team-based games. So the needs of one player might be different to the needs of another player within that same team. So we're seeing a very, very complex picture of performance in esports here and multiple needs. And I think it's actually the coach that can have an impact on identifying these needs and providing the support that is necessary to fulfill, satisfy, improve, advance those needs. So that's my argument for esports coaching, or part of it. Caveat to that is I don't believe the coach is responsible for all of those things, working in all of those areas. But I feel like a coach is a sort of first point of contact that can help set the player off in the right direction. So if the player is having problems with well-being, then the coach might be able to recognize that and put them in touch with a trained sport and exercise psychologist, for example. Moving forward, what sort of, when we're talking to esports coaches, when we're working with coaches at IFoEC, especially coaches that maybe have a background in sports, what do we make them aware of, especially considering the needs of those individual performers? Well, we like to touch on the career path. So consider, for example, the origins or the origins, how a lot of competitive gamers and how a lot of professionals in esports, how they started. We've done some research into this. We've spoken to professional players in League of Legends, for example, and a lot of them start out by themselves, often in a bedroom. They often play for fun. They often play for friends, play with friends. The game is often the teacher, and they enjoy learning through just playing the game and getting feedback from the game and improving their skill that way. They play in that sort of situation. They might play at school a little bit, and they might play in an after-school club, but that is generally how they experience gaming for many, many years. Until at some point they might decide to club together with their friends and start playing competitively. Might see that they're suddenly doing very well in a certain game and try and recruit them. So send them a message, for example, and say, hey, I noticed your rank was particularly high. Would you consider joining our team for X tournament or an upcoming split, for example? What's interesting about this part of the journey is that it's not, in theory, it's not dissimilar to athletes or performers in sport, except in sport, the athlete would be familiar with that structured training environment and being coached and having to work with players that maybe aren't their friends much, much, much earlier. So it's not mid-teens that the individual encounters that structured coached environment for the first time. If you think about academy football players, they're often in a training environment from 5, 6, 7 years old on a field being coached. And that's not really the case as of yet in esports. And it's a conversation for another day as to whether that's right or wrong. But essentially, it changes perhaps how the coach should approach individuals that are entering competitive gaming and structured, organized team environments for the first time. And then you can think about if they stay in that environment and they do get to grips with it and they do start performing well and they reach a level where it becomes their career, what are the needs of the individual that makes a career out of gaming? So competitive gaming, I should say. So, I mean, this is suddenly an individual that has devoted a significant amount of time to gaming. It's a person that is gaining most of their income from gaming, and maybe they have others that are reliant on them staying at that level. They're aware that maybe there aren't that many spots available, and they have to maintain a certain standard to maintain that career, maintain that income. And they also know that there's a huge group of people behind them that would take their spot in a heartbeat. So they have to stay on their toes a little bit. We've also got to think, especially the coach, what are they developing in that situation that transfers to valuable skills that they can use in everyday life and perhaps use for a career after playing, because they won't be in that, they probably won't be gaming competitively for their entire working career. And if they left after a couple of years, what do they have? I mean, a lot of the pros don't go to university. Instead, they sign with a team, and that becomes their main occupation, and they don't study alongside it. So what is the coach doing to put that individual in a position to have a meaningful experience that is beneficial, not only in terms of their playing career, but also in terms of general life? So these are all things that we like to introduce and talk about with coaches. And it doesn't mean that the coach is responsible for answering all these questions and meeting all the needs that stem from this. But it's simply introducing the idea that there might be more to it than just the game-specific stuff. So I hope that makes sense. And again, you might disagree. You might think it is just sport with a computer in front of you, and that's totally fine. But there are a few ways in which I think it differs noticeably from coaching in sport. Firstly, there are different routes. So we're talking about coaching a video game. And actually, sports coaching today has typically emerged from two different areas. So one is working to a set curricula for the development of fundamental movement skills. So you're working on a routine that you execute, and you're graded on your ability to execute that routine. The other is the military. So working through drills that have to be executed correctly, and the feedback is often strong. And if you don't do it correctly, it's redo, 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 or there might be punishment. That's quite different to the goals of video gaming. That's quite different to the goals of competitive gaming. or the roots of it at least. Secondly, there are different methods. So the sports coach can typically take their sport and break it down and take it apart and isolate certain skills. And that might be a bit of a contested area at the moment in sports coaching literature, but generally it's seen as you can do drill-based practice and training, and you can engage in deliberate practice, which might be to some the sort of repetition of a drill until it's executed to a standard that the coach deems as being correct. Rightly or wrongly, that's perhaps a traditional view of what coaching is. And we can't always achieve that in esports. So certainly in League of Legends, there might be a practice tool, there might be other game modes, but usually they're not seen as the best use of a competitive gamer's time. So they typically don't engage in it. And at the moment, I think coaches see few alternatives or see few meaningful alternatives to really practice other than repeatedly playing games and having perhaps a pre-scrim review and post-game debrief and review of how it went. There are certain pedagogical skills that you could apply to that, which is something that we try and promote at IFoEC, which is a conversation for another day. But at the moment, the point is limited methods. Thirdly, different setting. So, of course, there is, at the highest level, some competitions that take place on stage, in person, but a large proportion of esports takes place online via Discord. And coaches have to operate in that setting, and they have to support their players by means of a microphone and a video camera and some text chat, perhaps, or a shared whiteboard, which I'm a big fan of. But this is a different setting. This isn't on the field. Sometimes you don't have players that are willing or would like to or feel comfortable putting their webcams on. So you're missing a big chunk of communication there. You're missing nonverbal body language. You're only going by what they're saying. And that is quite different to what happens in sports. And the coaches maybe have to be more receptive to sort of the tone of voice that's being used, what's being said, what's not being said. So it's a different setting in some ways. And maybe it requires the same skills, but in different proportions to what happens in sport. And finally, I mean, esports, most games are hugely complex. And by complex, I mean, there's a mass of data that you can look at. There's a mass of game-specific statistics. There's recordings of the voice comms. We're seeing research right now that's looking at sort of eye tracking and looking at using the webcams to sort of track the emotional expressions on the face. There's a lot of data available to coaches and their coaching staff to use and to analyze. And there is data, of course, in sport, but in esport, we're working through an on-screen avatar. We're working through a champion. And does that complicate things? I think it probably does complicate things. Not least for if you're looking to scout and recruit as a coach and you're watching a game on the other side of the globe, you're just seeing what's on screen. You're not seeing what's behind the screen. You're not seeing how that player interacts with teammates. You're not hearing how they interact with teammates. You're not seeing what they're like off the pitch. Off the rift, I should say. And I know that's not common, but it's just much harder to get a feel for what that individual is like and whether they perhaps are a good fit for your team. So it's a complex world, and in some ways, as I hope I've summarized, quite different to coaching in sports. I'm going to move on now. So we know that the role might be slightly different. What is the experience of being a coach in esports? So I try to answer this with the third study of my PhD, which I started in autumn 2020, and it's been through a few rounds of submission rejection, but I'm happy to say I presented it at the International Society of Sports Psychology's conference in last autumn. You might recognize some of my co-authors there: Jack Fenton at Warwick, Ismael Pedraza Ramirez, formerly at Rogue, now at Team Vitality, and a couple of UK universities involved too. And what we did was we interviewed 14 professional League of Legends head coaches, and these were a high level. So I would say one was tier 3, most were tier 2, and a couple were tier 1 coaches. So they were working at the sort of higher level of League of Legends. They were working with most of them were working with full-time players. Some of them working with what we might call part-time. But these were coaches with a lot of experience and working with players that sort of represented at least Western competitive gaming at the higher levels. And we wanted to explore their experiences and behaviors. And we asked questions like, what are the experiences that have influenced you the most as a coach? How would you describe your coaching style? We even asked very open, fairly ambiguous questions like, how does it feel when you're coaching? And we got some strange some questioning questions back. But once we explained and probed and explored, these coaches really were willing to share their experiences and happy to have someone talk to them about them, and were interested in what the future might be for coaching in esports. Anyway, the findings of this study were quite revealing. 4 sort of findings that I'll present to you today. We looked at all the responses and we pulled out themes, so patterns that we could recognize. I'm going to present the patterns to you now. So the first pattern or theme was that the coaches had got to into their role following no set career path. They had no structure to follow. There was no career ladder in front of them, and very little support along the way. So they really worked through trial and error. They worked through social networks. They tried to demonstrate their value by all sorts of creative ways. For example, yes, maybe I was a former player, but often it wasn't that I was a former player that was the sort of primary reason for them getting their positions. It was more who they knew and whether that person had a good relationship with them, and whether they were willing to put their time into, for example, providing feedback on a VOD from that team. And there was a lot of trial and error along the way for them to access those positions. This quote summed it up quite nicely. Coaches don't have coaches to make them better. Coaches are a very solitary role, or coaching is a very, very solitary role, where you are doing you to make yourself better as opposed to having a coach to coach you. So really, they were saying it's quite an isolated role, and I experienced that myself in sport. And it was palpable that it's also perhaps a case at that point in esports too. Secondly, coaches reported feeling an enormous pressure to win. So social media, there was immediate feedback on whether a team won or was winning or was losing. There was immediate outcome sort of orientated feedback, and it was always critical of the performance. And coaches were aware of this, and it was often hard to take and protect players from that. Thirdly, it was obviously challenging to work in this digital global environment. So challenging in the respect that sometimes you have players from quite different cultures. Maybe there was language barriers there. Maybe it was purely online, and perhaps the technology that the setup someone had wasn't as good as someone else's. Maybe there were failures, for example, internet dropping out halfway through a scrim. There were challenges to overcome to move a team into a place where it was effective and functioning well together. Finally, coaches would definitely often say the right thing, and they, as I said, they drew from far and wide to inspire their coaching. For example, autobiographies of famous coaches in sports, and I think a lot of them had the best intentions, but they found it quite hard to enact these because of the constraints of esports. So, for example, coaches wanted to invest in their players and develop them and work on these things outside of the game, but if the coach and the player only had a 3-month contract, it was very difficult to spend the time outside of just working on playing the game repeatedly within that sort of constraint, knowing that you're maybe going to be out the door in the next couple of weeks. This was summarized quite nicely by this quote that we always want to say, so we being coaches, we always want to say going into every discussion, everything, that we are offering equality, but the star player is just a little bit more equal. So yes, we want to develop everyone on the team, but sometimes short-term contracts mean that we have to perform immediately. So we maybe lean on the player that we perceive to be the best. So challenges there and experiences there that are very similar to coaching in sport. And perhaps we can take inspiration from a lot of the work around coach education and coach development that's been done in sport to improve things for coaches in esports. One of the things we're trying to do at IFoEC is provide some sort of structured training. Dare I say it, maybe some courses that coaches could take to dip their toe in the water and maybe get a certificate. And I know certificates in esports are another thing, but to have something of value back in return for their time, rather than just devoting years to their game and then perhaps burning out and exiting without much to show for their time. So there are ways here where we can provide support to coaches, we think. So where next? A big thing that we'd like to see is improved standards for safeguarding. So we would like to promote what we're doing and be more vocal and more active in this space around concerning safeguarding in esports. So this means that organizations have appropriate policies in place. They have a designated safeguarding lead within their organization somewhere. The coach is familiar with the processes of what should happen when a flag is raised, for example. And we feel we should be doing more in this because, as I said at the very beginning, esports carries the same risks that internet usage carries. It's just another means through which bad actors can do bad things. Secondly, education. I've been in and around, I think it's 7 universities now, and education is I think a good way of improving things in esports and promoting a good message and keeping it as positive as it can be. I will mention that we've worked in the past with the NSE, and we're hoping to carry that on, where a couple of times every academic year we provide a free online workshop to students around coaching, and we try and do some practical activities that aspiring and existing coaches can take away with them to work with their student society. If they're a coach already, to work with their players, even if they're just coaching friends or want to coach friends, they can use some of the activities and the knowledge and skills we deliver through these workshops in those settings. We've also got a quite exciting thing happening at the end of the year. There's a diploma over in France, a partnership between a couple of universities over there, delivering a diploma around esports. And one module there is esports performance, and we're going to be delivering part of that esports performance module. We do applied support too, so we worked with a few teams in the past, and I won't name drop, but a couple of them were fairly high profile. And we've got an exciting project coming up with a group called Pixel Bar in the UK. And the owners of Pixel Bar basically have a group of players, and they want to see what happens if they give that group of players the best possible support, and whether that group of players, and we're supporting this time, is going to be a Rocket League team. In the future, they might expand. What happens if there's a holistic framework of qualified, trained individuals around the players? What can be achieved? So that'd be quite an interesting project to be part of. And winning isn't a condition, which is also quite nice. It's simply the support for the players. And then finally, research. So every step forward that we take in the industry, we want to underpin that with some objective evidence that we're doing the right thing, and even just being critical of the practices that we take for granted. So that could be applying what we think works in sports into esports without the underpinning evidence, the underpinning scientific, peer-reviewed, objective research. We can't know if it's actually the best thing and working in the best interests of the players and the coaches and whoever that intervention might be directed towards. So try and underpin things with research wherever possible. And the more the research is there, the more that evidence base is there, that improves the education, that improves the support for people in the field, people in the trenches, and hopefully performance and the standards of the industry in every regard also improve. So that's sort of a non-negotiable for us. All right, I waffled for probably far too long, but thanks everyone for listening and sticking with it. I hope that was mildly enjoyable. Becky, I don't know.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was super interesting. Thank you so much for running through that. Obviously, I've never actually really looked too much into kind of like what goes into esports coaching and coaching in esports. And you've definitely opened my eyes to a lot of things. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to move over to the Google Meet. For those of you who in chat who are part of the FutureGen cohort. For everyone else, if they want to reach out to you, Matt, where can they find you if they want to have questions for you and about IFoEC?
Sure. So we do have a website, ifoec.com. It's not the prettiest, but it is under construction or renovation. I think it's probably best to email me, matt@ifoec.com, or feel free to DM me via Twitter, as probably with most people on the call today, that I spend far too long on Twitter. So
And what's your Twitter handle, for just in case?
So @Matthew J. Watson.
Awesome.
The J is a middle name that you'll never find out.
Awesome. Okay. And yes, for anyone else who's interested in the previous FutureGen broadcasts that we've done, you can go to the NSE website, nsc.gg. In the sidebar, there's a FutureGen section, so you can kind of see the previous broadcasts we've done and different topics, so everyone can learn a little bit about various topics in esports. So thank you so much, everyone, and catch you next time.